Professor Kroenig, members of the Council, guests and friends, on behalf of our Board of Trustees, it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening. As you all know, our topic this evening is the case for the Trump foreign policy. But let me also remind you that a week from now, Wednesday the 13th, in this room, Jake Sullivan, who's now teaches in the law school at Yale, who was the senior foreign policy advisor to Hillary Clinton in the last campaign and a deputy assistant to her at State Department, and Joe Biden's national security advisor, who will be speaking on the United States and global leadership in the 21st century. That's a week from this evening. We're an equal opportunity organization. This council has been dedicated to a lot of things over the years, but one thing which it has done religiously since its founding is to make every effort to present as clearly as it can the foreign policy of the incumbent administration. And we even do that in our conferences for secondary school and college students, where we try to have as many State Department representatives as possible speaking to the students and faculty. So in any case, that's a major objective, and I was absolutely delighted when I read Professor Kroenig's article in Foreign Affairs on the case for the Trump foreign policy, because some of you may have noticed that not everybody is enthusiastic about that, and some of the papers which we read every day are strongly critical. So it's become a little difficult to get a clear picture of it. So I was absolutely delighted to see that article. And there are a few more scholars who are now joining and making serious analyses of the administration's positions. Professor Kroenig is a graduate of the University of Missouri. Dormitories closing there. He graduated cum laude. He holds a master's degree and a Ph.D. in international relations from the University of California, Berkeley. He's done postdoctoral work at Harvard, University of California, Stanford, and under a fellowship from the Council on Foreign Relations. He was at the CIA for a period of time, initially in his career, doing analyses, military analyses there. He later was at the Department of Defense and was one of the major authors of the first strategy for a government-wide approach to keeping terrorist organizations and groups from forming. He's written half a dozen books, or authored or co-authored them. And they've been mostly on the questions of nuclear deterrence and the problems of keeping their spread under control. But he's written a number of articles in the major journals that we respect most on a wide range of aspects of American foreign policy, including not only, again, the deterrence questions and the proliferation questions, but he's also focused on Asia and Europe and the Middle East. He's written about terrorism and its difficulties, and also on the questions of soft power, and interestingly and very importantly in our foreign policy, democracy. So he brings, and he's shared these observations with many through the most impressive media outlets. But tonight he's going to share his views with us, and we're absolutely delighted at that. So it's my very great pleasure to present Professor Matthew Kroenig.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Frank. It's really a pleasure to be here in Baltimore at the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. My wife and one-year-old daughter and I drove up from Washington this afternoon and spent a lovely afternoon just next door at the Baltimore Aquarium. wasn't quite sure if my one-year-old daughter would understand or not, but she was fascinated by the dolphins. So I guess our fascination with dolphins begins young. But tonight, not here to talk about dolphins, here to talk about President Trump's foreign policy, the Trump administration's foreign policy. As Frank rightly pointed out, I think it's safe to say that the Trump administration foreign policy hasn't been universally praised. It's come under a lot of criticism, and I think some of the criticism is justified, but I also think that the administration is doing a better job than they're getting credit for. That people often focus on controversial statements, controversial tweets, and miss the underlying policy. And the underlying policy, in my view, is quite good, and in fact, in many respects, an improvement over the previous administration, over President Obama's foreign policy. So I'd like to lay out my argument in three parts. First, go back and review the Obama administration's foreign policy. And I think this is important because we need to compare Trump's foreign policy not to some ideal, perfect standard, but according to realistic standards. And I think comparing him to his immediate predecessor is a fair standard. Second, I want to talk about the foreign policy team that President Trump has put in place. And then third, and for most of the talk, I'd like to focus on the substance of the Trump administration's policy, doing kind of a tour around the world from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and talk about the overall strategy. And then I want to finish in enough time to have Q&A because I'm very interested in what you have to say, and I look forward to the engagement and the discussion. So let's begin by talking about President Obama's foreign policy. So when President Obama took office, David Sanger, reporter for the New York Times, wrote a good book called The Inheritance, basically arguing that President Obama was inheriting a terrible international situation, war in Iraq and Afghanistan, an advancing Iranian nuclear program. And Sanger basically concluded, good for him that he won the presidency, but geez, I'm not sure I'd want to take on all of these challenges. And so the question I want to ask is did Obama leave the world off better than where he found it? And I would argue that he did not, that he inherited a difficult situation and he passed on an even worse situation to President Trump. So if we look in Europe, when Obama came to office, Europe was stable. By the time he left, Russia was invading Ukraine, invading Crimea, making nuclear threats against the United States and the rest of Europe. In Asia, again, Asia was fairly stable. When Obama left, China was becoming more aggressive, taking contested territory from U.S. treaty allies in the South China Sea. The North Korean nuclear program advanced greatly under President Obama's watch. The Obama administration had this policy of strategic patience with North Korea, which had a certain logic to it, but in essence, at the end of the day, meant they kind of ignored North Korea as its program continued to advance. We now believe that North Korea has enough nuclear weapons for enough nuclear material for several dozen weapons and ballistic missiles capable of reaching the United States. In the Middle East, I think the record is also poor. Yes, Obama inherited difficult counterinsurgency campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, but he left a terrorist state in the Middle East, ISIS. He drew a red line over chemical weapons use in Syria and then backed down from that red line, damaging U.S. credibility around the world. In my trips to Asia, South Korean and Japanese officials said to me, should we trust the United States to live up to their security guarantees to us? If Obama draws these red lines and walks away from them, how can we know that he'll be there to defend us if we're attacked by North Korea or by China? So yes, President Obama inherited two difficult counterinsurgency campaigns, but he left really a world in disarray. The three most important geostrategic regions for the United States, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, were worse when President Trump took office than when President Obama took office. So President Trump is walking into an even more difficult situation, I think, than President Obama did, and we need to take that into account. But I also think that this means that there is some room for improvement. And as I'll talk about later, I do think that the Trump administration has taken concrete steps to improve on some of these difficult situations. Second part of the talk, I'd like to focus on the team that Trump is building. So President Trump promised during the campaign that he would assemble a team of the, quote, best and the brightest. And at the highest levels of national security, he has put in place a good team. Mattis, McMaster, and Tillerson in particular have gotten a lot of attention. I think Mattis and McMaster in particular are doing a great job. I've had the pleasure of working with both of them before in my time in the U.S. government. Still in touch with them to some degree, although they're quite busy, as you can imagine. But both capable of far-sighted strategic thinking, both effective leaders. And to Trump's credit, he's hired good people and he's given them a lot of freedom. The Obama administration really micromanaged the military. Trump is giving Mattis a lot more leeway to conduct defense policy, conduct military operations overseas as he sees fit. Now, the Trump administration has been criticized for filling the national security bureaucracy too slowly. And I agree with that criticism. Especially at the State Department, there are too many political appointments that have yet to be filled. And that's important for any administration to implement their policy, to have their team in place. So that is a problem. But I would like to point out what often goes unnoticed is that the people who are in place are really quite excellent. And they're people who would work for any Republican administration, not just the Trump administration, people with experience and expertise. So Brian Hook, the Director of Policy Planning at the State Department, old colleague of mine, very effective, was an Assistant Secretary of State in the Bush administration. John Huntsman, our ambassador to Russia. Many of you know Ambassador Huntsman, at least by reputation, former ambassador to China, former governor of Utah, former presidential candidate. Again, very effective. John Rood, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Elbridge Colby, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy. I could go on and on and on, but the people who are there are very good and very experienced. Again, too many positions unfilled, but the people who are there are good. Third part of the talk, and the most important part of the talk, let's talk about the substance of President Trump's foreign policy. Because again, I think people often focus on high-level statements, on tweets, and don't look at the underlying policy and what's actually going on. So first, let's talk about the foreign policy kind of philosophy broadly. America First has taken a lot of criticism. The United States has, especially since World War II, has taken a leading role in international affairs, has a broad network of alliances around the world, and people saw America First maybe as signaling a return to isolationism, that this was a return to U.S. policy in the 20s and 30s, withdrawing from the world. And I think we can see after a year that that's clearly not the case, that the United States under the Trump administration remains engaged around the world. And I should also point out that the America First language isn't that different from some of the language we heard under Obama and Bush. So Obama talked about nation building at home, that the United States needs to pull back from the world and other centers will step up. President Bush, Richard Haass, President Bush's Director of Policy Planning, talked about how it was important for the United States to get its own house in order, that we needed to focus more domestically. Maybe we'd been too engaged overseas and time to turn our attention home. And so I see America First as somewhat consistent with that the United States does have urgent challenges at home. And of course, we do need to be strong at home to be strong abroad. We need to have a strong economy. We need to have a strong military. And I think the Trump administration has taken steps to improve both of those things. So looking at the economy first, if you just look at the numbers, I think it's clear that the economy is doing well. Unemployment at 4.1%, low rate. S&P 500 booming, the stock market at all-time highs. Economic growth over 3%. Now, of course, this isn't all President Trump's doing. A lot of it is policies put in place by his predecessor. A lot of it is accident. But I do think that the promises of tax cuts, the deregulation that has already taken place, promises of infrastructure investment have boosted business confidence. And, at a minimum, I think dire predictions that if Trump was elected, the economy was going to immediately tank have turned out to be incorrect. The economy's doing quite well. Next, military spending. President Trump has talked about peace through strength. This is something many Republican presidential candidates have talked about. Reagan talked about peace through strength. There has been a bipartisan consensus for the past several years that we're under-investing in our military, in part due to the sequester put in place by Congress. Bipartisan consensus for the past few years that we needed to go back to a military budget that Secretary Gates talked about in 2010 or 2011. But in the final years of the Obama administration, again, a bipartisan consensus among defense experts that we are underinvesting. Trump has promised to reverse that. He said he's going to put in place a historic military buildup. The National Defense Authorization Act that was just passed by Congress last week would, if Congress can get over these limits in the sequester, would put in place a historic defense buildup that many defense experts argue that we need with new challenges from China and Asia, from Russia and Europe. So if this new NDAA goes into effect, it will be a $700 billion increase to defense spending over the next 10 years beyond what Obama was planning on spending. In addition, President Trump, I think rightly, has focused on nuclear and missile defense. He said that the United States will, he said that it would be great if no country has nuclear weapons, but if the countries have nuclear weapons, the United States should be, quote, at the top of the pack. Many people said that this was reckless language. Let me just remind you that President Kennedy said that the United States should have a nuclear arsenal, quote, second to none. That Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said that the United States will have more nukes than, what was the quote? Way more nukes than everybody else and more than we'll ever need. So arguing that the United States will have a strong nuclear deterrent is, again, I think something that's been consistent with U.S. policy for several decades. And we are entering a second nuclear age. President Obama had this idea that the United States would reduce reliance on nuclear weapons, would cut our nuclear arsenal, and that other countries would kind of blindly follow our lead. Instead, we saw that they saw an opportunity and went in the exact opposite direction. Russia, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea all expanded and modernized their nuclear arsenals as we reduced ours. Russia, Pakistan, North Korea in particular relying more, not less, on nuclear weapons in their strategy. And so the Trump administration, I think, rightly focused on strengthening nuclear deterrence to deal with these new nuclear threats. Going from the kind of broad economy, military, let's go region by region, starting first with Asia. North Korea has been in the news a lot, and it is, I think, the most urgent national security threat facing the country. North Korea is only the third country after Russia and China that has the ability to threaten nuclear war against the U.S. homeland. The first country to gain this, third U.S. adversary, I should say. Implausible that we'd have a nuclear war anytime soon with Britain or France. They have the capability but not the intention. But in terms of potential adversaries, Russia, China, and now North Korea, the only countries that can threaten nuclear war against the United States. North Korea, the first country to gain this capability since the 1960s. So this is, I think, the most urgent challenge facing the United States, and the Trump administration is right to prioritize it. H.R. McMaster has said this is the foremost national security priority of the Trump administration. And again, there have been a lot of focus on these tweets and what do they mean. But the underlying strategy is very good, and the underlying strategy, I think, has two major elements. First, what they're calling, quote, maximum pressure and engagement, looking to increase the economic, military, political pressure on North Korea to try to force them to the table for an engagement portion to try to get serious talks over denuclearization. But second, realizing that first part is going to be hard, is going to take time, we need to have a serious defense and deterrence policy in place. And to deter North Korea, and God forbid if North Korea attacks, to have serious military options to defend ourselves and defend our allies. So when the Trump administration talks about having credible military options, I think many in the media say, oh my God, we're going to war. That's not how I see it. I see the Trump administration as saying we need to be able to defend ourselves. We need to have serious military options to deter North Korea from attacking. In China, the Trump administration, President Trump talked tough about China on the campaign trail. He talked about China's unfair trade practices, and in fact, those are a major concern. He talked about China's activity in the South China Sea, another major concern. So far, the Trump administration has been pretty soft on China, though, and I think the reason is they've decided to prioritize North Korea, that we can use Chinese help to put pressure on North Korea. That's the priority right now. But I do suspect that over the course of the 4 years, the Trump administration will turn and try to address some of these other problematic issues with China, including the South China Sea and trade. Alliances. I was in Seoul a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to Japan next week. I often meet with South Korean and Japanese diplomats in Washington, D.C. A lot being said about what they're thinking. The diplomats I talk to anyway say that they're pretty happy with the Trump administration approach. They don't want the Trump administration to get them into a war. but they're glad that the United States is finally making this priority. A lot of focus on the South Korean position. The Japanese position has been probably more hardline than the Trump administration position. If you've paid attention to some of the statements from Abe, the Japanese really want to think that getting tougher with North Korea is the way to solve the problem. So it's pivoting from Asia back to Europe. Much was said on the campaign trail, and I think many people view the Trump administration's foreign policy to Europe through the lens of some of the things that were said on the campaign trail, of NATO being outdated, of maybe we'll pull out of NATO, of the things that President Putin said that were, or President Trump said, excuse me, that were conciliatory I'll let that go unremarked, without a remark. Some of the things that President Trump said that were conciliatory towards President Putin. What's interesting, if you look at the underlying policy, the Trump administration has been pretty tough on Russia and pretty good to Europe. So the Trump administration has done a lot of things that President Putin isn't going to like very much. They've kept the sanctions in place on Russia. They've conducted airstrikes against Russia's ally in Syria, on Assad, for the chemical weapons use. The European Reassurance Initiative, a NATO effort that was put in place after the Russian invasion of Ukraine to respond to any kind of Russian incursion into NATO and Eastern Europe. The Trump administration has increased spending on the European Reassurance Initiative by $1 billion over Obama levels, allowed a new member into NATO. And also building up the nuclear and missile program, including Mattis announced a couple of weeks ago that the United States is going to start research and development into a new intermediate range nuclear-capable missile as a way to counter Russia's cheating on the INF Treaty. INF may be the most important arms control treaty ever negotiated, eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. The Russians have been cheating on it for 10 years or so. The Trump administration argues that it's going to respond. So again, the underlying policy, pretty tough on Russia, pretty good to NATO. And again, I was in, part of this job means traveling a lot. I was in Prague last week. I was in Brussels last month. And the NATO officials I talked to say that, there's a lot of stuff said. We kind of ignore that. There's good outreach from Mattis, from McMaster, from Pence. We look at the underlying policy, we talk to our counterparts, and the cooperation between the United States and NATO remains strong. In fact, I was in Prague last week, and there's something of a controversy over President Trump in Prague, and you might be surprised to hear this. The controversy is that the Czech Republic president brags about what a good relationship he has with President Trump, brags about how he and President Trump are very similar, and it's a controversy in Prague because in Prague they say, well, that would be wonderful if you really had this great friendship with President Trump, but we don't believe you. Why haven't you got a state visit to Washington? Why are Abe and Xi getting these state visits and you're not getting it? It may not be our impression, but some European leaders, bragging about what a good relationship they have with President Trump. Turning to the Middle East, again here I think the Trump administration has made some improvements over the failures of the Obama administration. So one is this promise to renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. And many people scoffed on the campaign trail, scoffed to this day when President Trump says he'll renegotiate the deal. The truth is, though, that even Obama administration officials who negotiated the deal, they don't like the term renegotiate, but they say that follow-on negotiations at some point in the next couple of years are going to be very important because there are sunset clauses in the deal. So these limits on Iran's nuclear program expire over time. We can't just let them expire, or else Iran will have a rapid path to a nuclear weapon. So we do need follow-on negotiations. European diplomats agree that we need follow-on negotiations. The problem is that it's tough to get international support for that. We just went through this difficult, decade-long path of negotiating the deal in the first place. Trying to get everybody to come back to the table and renegotiate again would have been difficult, especially under Hillary Clinton. The difference now, and even Obama administration officials I talked to say the difference now is we have a president who can credibly threaten to walk away from the deal altogether. And that gives us leverage to go to the Europeans, to go to the Iranians and others and say, let's come back, let's talk about these sunset clauses, let's address ballistic missiles, let's address some of the weaknesses in the deal, otherwise the thing might fall apart altogether. And so I think at the expert level, there is a bipartisan consensus that Trump's tough rhetoric can provide us some leverage to allow us to renegotiate the deal. On ISIS, under the Trump administration, the United States has succeeded in taking away the territory that ISIS controlled. ISIS controlled large swaths of territory in Syria and Iraq. Obama called them the JV team. They took over large amounts of territory. The Obama administration did begin the policy of put in place the basic strategy of taking this territory back, and so they deserve some credit. But it was finished under the Trump administration. And Brett McGurk, who's worked on Iraq and terrorism issues in the region for Bush, Obama, and Trump, does say that the Trump administration policy of taking the shackles off the military, of giving authority to lower-level commanders to make operational decisions, was very helpful in those final few stages. So I think the Trump administration does deserve credit there in completing the war to take territory from ISIS. But I think the Trump administration's biggest accomplishment in the Middle East, and maybe more broadly, was the reaction to Assad's use of chemical weapons and enforcing this red line over chemical weapons, the one that Obama had backed down from. I think it sends an important message about chemical weapons use, that's beyond the pale, and the United States won't stand for it. But I think it also reestablished American credibility more broadly. As I said before, there were many people who looked at Obama's backing down from the red line and questioned, is the United States still a military power? Is the United States willing to live up to its international commitments? And I think Trump's strikes in Syria caused people to update their evaluation and think that, at least under President Trump, the United States may be willing to use force again. We may need to pay attention to these alliances and not assume that it's just hot air. On trade, the Trump administration has been criticized a lot for trade, but China is engaging in unfair trade practices. Even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, there was a recent delegation that came back to Washington, was complaining about China's unfair trade practices, that we need to do something to counter this. So I think he's right about that. There were tough statements about NAFTA during the campaign trail. On the campaign trail, now there are efforts to update NAFTA. And there's widespread agreement that NAFTA does need to be updated. Doesn't contain just some of the basic provisions for internet commerce that are commonplace today that didn't exist in the 1990s when this deal was in place. And so that's what the negotiations are focused on now, kind of updating NAFTA for the current era. I do think it was a mistake to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, this big trade deal in Asia. But many business leaders in the United States, in finance, in advanced shipping, other advanced services, said, actually the terms of the deal weren't great for American business. We were willing to support it, but it really was looking for a geopolitical win, to some degree at the expense of American business. So my hope is that we can get some kind of multilateral trade deal in Asia, maybe one that advances both our strategic and our economic interest. It doesn't look like that's the Trump administration's plan, but I do think that would be the best way forward. Climate change, I also think it was a mistake to pull out of the Paris Agreement, in part because the promises in the Paris Agreement were non-binding. The United States could have just easily revised its contributions without pulling out of the agreement. But you may know the terms of the agreement require 4 years before one can formally withdraw. And so my understanding is there are some in the Trump administration saying, well, within this 4 years, maybe we can revisit this. Maybe we can just change our contributions and stay in after all. I think it was mostly a symbolic statement to say we were withdrawing. I think it was the wrong symbol, but it was mostly symbolic. So turning to wrap up, it's been mostly a positive picture. Are there any weaknesses? Well, I do think there are some weaknesses. As I pointed out, I think on trade, pulling out of TPP was a mistake. I think pulling out of Paris was a mistake. I think the biggest weakness the administration has, though, is staying on message. So the president will say one thing, the advisors will say something else. There'll be a tweet on one thing. And I think that is a real weakness. I think what the United States says in the world, what a U.S. president says, means a lot. Our allies are watching, our adversaries are watching, and I think that's the one place where the Trump administration really needs to improve. But I also think that the audience, including ourselves, need to do a better job of not just assuming the tweets are everything and not assuming the statements are everything. Because as I've tried to make the case, if you look below that level, if you look at the underlying policy, if you look at the people who are putting them in place, there's actually quite a lot of good going on. And in many areas, as I've said, I think actually an improvement over our previous president. So I think I'll end my formal remarks there and look forward to question and answer.
Well, we certainly thank you for a most comprehensive and succinct case for the Trump policy. Yes, sir. Two questions. How unwise would it be to end the Iran deal? And secondly, are we really being tough on Russia?
Yeah. Well, great questions. Thank you very much. So first on the Iran deal. I think we can have a discussion on what would the consequences be if the United States pulled out of the deal altogether. But that's not the Trump administration policy. The Trump administration policy is to renegotiate the deal. And so the Trump administration policy, as I see it, is to stay in the deal, but abide by the strict terms of the deal, but basically do to Iran what Iran's doing to us. Iran is barely abiding by the strict terms of the deal. But in all of the areas not covered in the deal, they're vigorously competing, advancing their ballistic missile program, challenging our allies in the region, becoming more aggressive in the region, supporting terror and proxy groups. And so the Trump administration policy is to do the same thing back, to barely abide by the strict terms of the deal, to live up to the agreement, but to get tougher on Iran in all of the ways not covered under the terms of the deal. So when Iran conducts new ballistic missile tests, new sanctions for ballistic missiles, which aren't covered in the nuclear deal. When Iran supports terrorist groups or conducts human rights violations, new sanctions for those things that aren't covered in the nuclear deal. Putting in place a strategy to counter Iran's influence in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, to push back against Iran's growing influence in the Middle East. Again, all things not covered in the deal. So the purpose of that strategy is really twofold. One is to deal with these other problems that Iran is causing. And again, I think that's an improvement over the Obama administration, because the Obama administration approach was to prioritize the nuclear issue above all else. And they were afraid that if they got tough with Iran in these other areas, that was going to cause Iran to pull out of the nuclear deal. And so to avoid running that risk, the Obama administration went soft on Iran in these other areas. So the Trump administration is saying, okay, we'll abide by the terms of the deal, but these other things, you're not getting a free pass on this anymore. We're going to push back on that. The second purpose of that, though, is by pushing back on that, to try to bring additional pressure to bear on the Iranians, and to try to use that additional pressure to say, let's go back and look at some of these weaknesses in the nuclear deal. And so to just be more concrete, the nuclear deal, all the limits on Iran's nuclear program expire. There are these so-called sunset clauses. So the most important restrictions expire after 10 years and then 15 years. So the deal's already been in place for 2 years. So about 8 years from now, Iran's going to have a rapid path to a bomb if we stay in the deal. So staying in the deal for 8 years means we're in real trouble. So we have to renegotiate the deal within the next 8 years. Again, the Obama administration and European diplomats, for whatever reason, don't like the term renegotiate. But if you call them follow-on negotiations, they're okay with that for some reason. So it's something of a semantic difference. But so we need follow-on negotiations at some point. And so the Trump administration's hope is that by putting pressure on Iran in these other ways, then we can say to the Iranians, maybe we'll pull back on some of this other stuff if you're willing to extend these sunset provisions. So instead of having the limits expire after 10 or 15 years, maybe we can push it to 25 years, maybe we can make them permanent. The other problem with the Iran nuclear deal is it doesn't cover Iran's ballistic missile program at all. And so right now we see with North Korea, one of the biggest challenges is not just their nuclear tests, but their missile tests, which are getting better and better, longer range, almost by the week. So Iran has a long-range missile program. The U.S. Missile Defense Agency estimates that Iran could have an ICBM capable of reaching the continental United States in the next several years. So Iran might join China and Russia and North Korea and become the fourth country with the ability to conduct long-range strikes against the United States. The nuclear deal doesn't cover ballistic missiles at all. So Iran's free to develop and test ballistic missiles fully in compliance with the deal. And so this is one of the other weaknesses of the deal that the Trump administration would like to try to address. So I think that's the strategy. Stay in the deal, but try to improve it, not tearing it up altogether. On Russia, you're absolutely right that Congress and the executive branch have a difference of opinion on how to use sanctions against Russia. And that's not unusual. You often see this tension between the legislative and the executive branch. We also saw it with the Obama administration over Iran sanctions. Congress was consistently pushing for tougher and tougher sanctions on Iran. The Obama administration was consistently telling them, hey guys, cool it. You're being too provocative. We're trying to negotiate here. Cool it on the sanctions. So I think we've seen something similar here with the Trump administration and Congress. Congress pushing for tougher sanctions. The Trump administration saying we don't think this is the best approach. So in a narrow sense, you're right. That is one area where the Trump administration could have gotten tougher with Russia and did not. I agree with you there, but there are a number of other areas where I think the Trump administration has done things to strengthen NATO, to be tough on Putin that Putin doesn't like. Again, strengthening the nuclear program, striking Assad in Syria, allowing new members into NATO, increasing defense spending for NATO.
Would you compare the danger and instability of Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea?
Well, and in particular, the point was made that a few years ago, many people said Pakistan was the most dangerous because of the instability and the terrorism and the nuclear weapons. You know, it reminds me of in 2004 presidential debate, John Kerry and George W. Bush agreed that the greatest threat to U.S. national security was the possibility of nuclear terrorism, the possibility that a terrorist group could acquire a nuclear weapon or nuclear material in a place like Pakistan, sneak it into the United States, and try to detonate it. And that is a threat, but geez, I mean, I would trade that for the threats that we have today. To imagine that that was the greatest threat to U.S. national security. Because today I think we have many serious challenges, and I think the most urgent is North Korea. As I pointed out, it's on the verge of acquiring this capability of threatening nuclear war against the United States, which has a number of serious consequences, even if that nuclear war never takes place. And so I think making that the priority makes sense to try to stop them from fully realizing that capability. But other serious challenges as well. If I had to put one thing at the top of my list, I think it would actually be Russia. Because I think there is a plausible pathway to nuclear war with Russia now for the first time since the late 1980s. And my biggest fear would be if Russia tried to replay its strategy from Ukraine against one of the Baltic states. And it's already doing some of the things that it did against the Ukrainians, against Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia right now, some of the information campaigns and other activities. So if Russia tried some kind of hybrid invasion of the Baltics, now this would be a NATO member. So the United States, the West, would have a difficult decision. Do we just let Russia have the Baltics? Maybe this means the end of NATO, the end of America's credibility worldwide. Or do we go to war with Russia over the Baltics? And every U.S. president has been very clear about this, that our policy would be to defend our allies. So now we're in a war with Russia. Russian strategy, as was pointed out, I focused a lot on nuclear issues. Russia has what they call a strategy of de-escalatory nuclear strikes. And so basically the idea is that they assess that if they used, in the event of a conventional war in the Baltics, if they used a small number of nuclear weapons against NATO forces, that U.S. and Western leaders would say, oh my God, we're not fighting a nuclear war with Russia over the Baltics, we're going to back down. And so the Russians are planning on using a small number of nuclear weapons early in a conflict as a way to try to frighten us into suing for peace on their terms. So then that puts us in a really difficult situation. Imagine you're President Trump or President Macron, any Western leader. Do you just back down and that's the end of NATO? Do you try to fight through it conventionally? Well, what if Russia continues to use nuclear weapons? These aren't just symbolic weapons. It would be almost impossible to win the war if they're using nuclear weapons on our conventional forces. Or do you retaliate with nuclear weapons? And if you retaliate with nuclear weapons, then we run the risk that it doesn't stay limited, that it escalates into a major nuclear exchange. So that's what I see as the biggest threat to U.S. national security right now. And I think, of course, it would be much better, rather than to get into that scenario, to deter it in the first place and to make it clear to Putin that We will defend our allies, that we do have a serious strategy for it, that we have a nuclear, to reinforce. There's always a dilemma or a tension in U.S. nuclear policy. On one hand, we want disarmament, arms control, nuclear reductions. On the other hand, we want to deter our adversaries. And we've always done this kind of balancing act. I think the Obama administration leaned heavily on the disarmament side. And I think there is a bipartisan consensus now we need to lean back more heavily on the deterrence side. And I think you'll see that when the Trump administration releases its new national security strategy and releases its new nuclear posture review. Again, to make it clear to President Putin that we have nuclear forces still, that we're willing to use them, not because we want to, but because we want to deter Russia from going first. Yeah.
Why say nice things about Mr. Putin? And why hollow out the State Department?
Well, very good questions again, and a few thoughts. So one, I think President Trump's desire to improve relations with Russia and Putin is not unusual. We saw that both George W. Bush and Obama came into office wanting to improve relations with Russia. Obama and Clinton talked about resetting relations with Russia. And we've constantly been disappointed, I think, in these efforts. So I think it's understandable that a new administration would want to try to improve relations. I'm skeptical that it will work just like it didn't work in the past. So I think it would be helpful to be tougher with Putin. I don't think the more obsequious comments are helpful. Because I do think that there's a very serious threat here, not just on the military side, but also on the efforts to undermine democracy, not just in the United States, but all across Europe. And in addition to my job at Georgetown, I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. One of my colleagues there just published a very good report on Russian activities in Western Europe called something like the Kremlin's Trojan Horse 2.0, but talking about all their activities to destabilize. So I think there is a lot more we could do. Well before we get to nuclear exchange, there's just more we could do in terms of bolstering the conventional forces on the ground in the Baltics to deter Russia from going down this route in the first place. So in sum, I think it's understandable why a president would want better relations with Russia. It would be a good thing for the world if we had better relations with Russia. But I do think now is the time for a firmer hand, not a softer one. Second question, hollowing out the State Department. There has been, there was a sense, I think, shared among many Republicans that the State Department had become bloated in the Obama years, a lot of special representative positions. And you can look online, this Plum Book, which is kind of the jobs, Senate-confirmed jobs in the U.S. government. And the number of special representative and special envoy jobs is really extraordinary. So I think cutting back some of those jobs makes a lot of sense. Reforming the State Department, I think, makes a lot of sense. But again, I think it is a shame that the administration has been so slow in filling out the political appointments. In terms of the career civilians leaving, I'm getting mixed views, because I do read the reports that you do, that people are leaving in droves. On the other hand, I talk to some other people who are there who say, the journalists are coming to this with a story that they want to report. They find the people who are leaving, they report on that. They're not reporting, the vast majority of people who are staying and serving their country. And some of the people I talk to say, I didn't vote for President Trump, I'm a Democrat, but he won the election, he's our president. If you devote yourself to the Foreign Service, you're devoting yourself, it's not a political job, you're devoting yourself to serve the country, to serve the president. I'm staying, the vast majority of us are staying. I wish the journalist would write some stories on that as well. So I'm hearing both sides of the story. It would be interesting to get some aggregate numbers. What percentage of people are staying versus leaving? Because now it feels like a little bit of a he said, she said, and hard to get to the ground truth. Yeah.
Would you comment on the recognition or the switch of the American embassy to Jerusalem? How does that affect American foreign policy?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was in my hotel room just before walking over. Your Senator Cardin, was on, and he said he supports the policy that the United States should recognize Jerusalem as the capital, that Israel is a sovereign state. If Israel wants Jerusalem to be its capital, we should recognize that. He just said that he doesn't know that he has confidence in this administration to carry it out effectively. He said he'd like to see the peace process continue. Senator Rubio, who I worked for Senator Rubio's presidential campaign, also released a statement today saying he supported this. And both of them pointed out, and I had actually forgotten this, 1995, Congress passed a law, bipartisan support, to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. President Clinton, on the campaign trail, said that if elected president, he would make recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He got into office and didn't do that. George W. Bush, on the campaign trail, promised that if he were elected, he'd make Jerusalem the capital, recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He didn't do that. President Trump said he would, and he did it. So to his credit, he followed through on his promise. I guess I agree with Senator Cardin that Israel's close security partner. They say Jerusalem is the capital. If they say that's their capital, then I don't know that it's up to us to say that it's not. Now, it's important to note also that Trump didn't say anything about what Jerusalem means. He wasn't saying Jerusalem in its entirety. I think that leaves out the possibility that East Jerusalem could be part of a Palestinian state. But the Knesset is in Jerusalem. Many of the Israeli government buildings are in Jerusalem, and so it doesn't make much sense for us to have our embassy in Tel Aviv. I think it would make sense to have it in Israel's actual capital.
Yeah. Would you expand on the trade observations you made earlier and the way in which that has enhanced China's hand? And secondly, would you comment upon the relationship between division within our country now and national security? Does that adequately capture your last 2 points? Good.
And there was a third, too, or does he only get two?
The third was informing all historians.
On the red line in Congress.
Yeah.
Okay. So first on the red line in Congress, you're right that many Republicans in Congress were unwilling to give President Obama the authorization to use force. Senator Rubio, who I worked for, said that he didn't trust President Obama to follow through on it effectively, and that's why he did not. But I think the prior point is that Obama went to Congress at all for a strike like this. I think Obama went to Congress because he was looking for a way out. Most presidents, if they were looking to use limited force in this way, would have done it. They wouldn't have asked for congressional approval. And so I think that was the mistake in the first place on Obama's part of going to Congress. Second, on TPP, I agree with you that I think that was one of the substantive mistakes of the Trump administration. I do agree that it's created an opening for China. In terms of what our allies in the region are doing, though, they're still looking for strong American leadership. They're not in any way bandwagoning with China. And in fact, one of the most interesting developments in Asian security right now is intra-Asian security cooperation with our partners. And I think this was something that was going to be inevitable, regardless of TPP or not. It's just going to be difficult for the United States, given our global responsibilities, to continue to counter Chinese military power in East Asia. We need our allies to step up, and we're seeing them do that. And so just a few weeks ago, there was the first meeting of the so-called Quad, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. So this is something the United States has been wanting to get going for a while. We had a meeting scheduled a few years ago, and the Australians backed out under Chinese pressure. But as China becomes more assertive in the region, I think our regional partners are becoming more concerned, want to do more to counter China, and so I think this Quad is an interesting step forward. There are also some movements on trilateral security cooperation between the United States, Japan, and South Korea to deal with the North Korean nuclear threat. And so I think this will be an important dynamic going forward in Asia. The United States relying more on its regional partners to step up and counter China. On domestic politics, I focus on foreign policy, so I'm going to pun on that one. So.
Only because every answer has been so wonderful. Ma'am, would you address the proposition that the president's approach to NAFTA might undercut basic relations with the countries of the area?
Yeah. There's a saying in American politics that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. I don't know that anybody's accused Trump of being a poet, but there were a lot of kind of big and vague promises made on the campaign trail, and now that he's in office, I think his team is trying to actually find workable solutions along these lines. So on the campaign trail, NAFTA was one of the things where he said, it's been a disaster, we're gonna tear it up, we're gonna renegotiate it. So it's kind of unclear what he was going to do. And so if what he wanted to do was to tear it up altogether, then I agree with you, that would be a mistake. The United States benefits from an open international trading system, and I think in a fair, open international trading system, the United States can compete with any country. But I think what we've seen is that the Trump administration's not tearing up NAFTA. They're engaged in negotiations now, trying to update it. And so, some of the provisions are focused on bringing it into the 21st century, dealing with e-commerce and other things. And I'm just not following the negotiations closely on a day-to-day basis. I think we'll have to see where it goes. If at the end of the day it stays in place and it's updated, that would be a good thing. Some of the other issues that have been in the news, Canadian softwood lumber, I think, is one of the issues. People are saying, Trump is being too hard on the Canadians over this softwood lumber. I mean, you may follow this more closely than I do, but my understanding is Obama, Bush, this has been an issue in U.S.-Canadian trade for some time. This isn't just the Trump administration. So from my perspective, it seems like it's a pretty standard trade negotiation, trying to update this thing, bring it into the 21st century. We'll have to see where it goes. If at the end of the day we scrap it altogether, I agree with you, that would be a mistake. But from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look to me like that's where we're going.
How effective is the personality, disposition, rhetorical style of the president relative to deterrence policy?
So Thomas Schelling was an economist at Harvard University, won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work on deterrence theory. And Schelling talked about the rationality of irrationality. And so essentially he argued that threatening to launch nuclear war is, in a sense, an inherently incredible threat. Why would you believe anyone would do that when it could mean nuclear retaliation and the end of your own civilization? So he argued it's actually helpful to have a reputation for being a little bit, maybe a little bit unstable when it comes to deterrence. And so he argued that one of his examples was Khrushchev during the Cold War. You may remember that Khrushchev, in the middle of a UN General Assembly talk, took his shoe off and pounded it on the lectern and said, "We will bury the West." And Schelling said that was the rationality of irrationality. And North Korean Kim Jong-un practiced this themselves. We often question whether Kim Jong-un is irrational or that North Koreans are irrational. I think they're supremely rational. It's amazing, I think, the way that family has run that country under difficult circumstances, difficult domestic circumstances, tough international pressure for decades. And I think part of the way they've done it is this rationality of irrationality. They've convinced everyone that any minor provocation is going to lead them to lash out with a major war, nuclear strikes, and it's made everyone treat them with kid gloves. So I think Trump has a little bit of that going to his advantage when it comes to deterring our enemies. I think that the North Koreans are afraid that maybe Trump would use force. And I think the Iranians think the same way. Certainly, I think they view the possibility that Trump would use force is greater than Obama's. And so I think that helps for deterrence. Now, where I think it doesn't help is with our allies. I think you want your allies to know where you stand, and I think our allies are sometimes confused where we stand because of the messaging. So that's where I'd grade them. I think in terms of deterrence, it's an improvement over the past administration. I think in terms of assuring our allies, we could be doing better.
I don't want to just say, are we going to have more Fords on the road? but that's close to it. But how does China fit into that?
Well, and I can...
Please, okay, good.
So I think the question was about, I talked about China's unfair trade practices, but many American businessmen see China as an economic opportunity, and that maybe the bigger concern should be our allies, Japan and South Korea, and some of their unfair trade practices. We're open to their products, but they have barriers up to ours. Well, I should start by saying I know there's a lot of expertise in the room, the business community here, so I'm interested in your views. I'm just an academic and nuclear deterrence expert, so I'm sure I could learn from you on trade. Well, I think all the above are problems to some degree. I do think that China's a problem. You know, many businesses in the United States have for years seen China as a huge opportunity. I think it was the CEO of Goldman Sachs one time who said, give me a number, any number, multiply it by 1 billion. That's why China's important. But I think many American businesses have been disappointed doing business in China. They see this huge market, and then they go in and they realize the Chinese government makes things difficult for them. A lot of red tape, a lot of requirements that they partner with Chinese businesses stealing the intellectual property. Maybe you've had different experiences, but also there's the China 2025 initiative, which some in the American business community argue is essentially a declaration of economic war. That China's identified some of the most important emerging fields, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, supercomputing, other areas, and said they want to dominate these industries by 2025. And so many in the American business community see that as a real threat. In terms of Japan and South Korea, though, I agree that that's a problem. The Trump administration has promised to renegotiate KORUS, and I've, again, been in Seoul talking about this issue. And I think that in Seoul they are open to discussing renegotiation. They would have preferred not to, but if the alternative is getting rid of KORUS altogether, they're willing to discuss possible adjustments they can make that would deal with this. Japan, a little bit more difficult, I think. We don't have an agreement. The TPP would have been one agreement between the United States and Japan. As you may know, Japan is trying to lead an effort now, the TPP 11, basically going forward with the TPP without the United States. There's some talk about a U.S.-Japan bilateral trade agreement. So maybe that would be possible. It could be along the lines of some of the terms in the original TPP. But I think that the Trump administration is attuned to these balance of trade issues, probably more so than any administration we've had in recent years. They're already renegotiating NAFTA, renegotiating KORUS, want to do something about Japan, and we'll just have to see where we end up.
Because this has been such a splendid evening, with every question answered with a kind of depth which I think all of us appreciate, and thoroughness, and also your ear for what everybody is asking is quite impressive, I must say, down to the adjectives. Therefore, I have to thank you and apologize to everybody who still has a question. It's time to end the session.